All right, welcome students. Hope everyone's doing well. Today we're going to talk about animals that may live in groups and living in a group and the kinds of things in animal behavior that go along with living in a group. And then we're going to move from there into the complex evolution of living in a group, and that'll be called sociobiology, the evolution of social behavior. And we'll get into that as we go. First, I like to start off this lecture by giving you a couple of questions to think about. So imagine you're going on a family reunion trip, and you and your family are all inside a cargo van or bus, that kind of thing, and the bus goes off the edge of the road and goes into this lake, as you can see here. And then the question I ask students is, how many of you would stay and try to help your family get out of the van? Or how many of you would bail on your family, get out of the van, and swim to shore? And that's the first of three questions like that. The next question, quite similar to that, is what if instead you're on a bus full of criminals? And people always ask, well, why would you be on a bus full of criminals? I don't know, maybe it's your job. And then they also ask, what kind of criminals are they? So I like to pick something that seems bad, but not, overly tragic, in a real cruel way. So these people, maybe they stole a bunch of money from the elderly or that kind of thing, or maybe they run a drug ring. So they haven't necessarily killed anybody, but they're not necessarily they didn't just steal mail or something of that sort. So you can pick which of those is sort of in the middle. And then I asked the same question: would you stay and help, or would you swim to shore? And we asked that question. Then the third question is, now you're on a bus and it's full of puppies, and how many would stay and help, and how many would swim to shore? And the reason I ask these three questions is what we find, and now it differs from person to person. So if you take any individual person, you do get different answers. But as a group, what we find is when it's the family versus the criminals versus the puppies, so if those are criminals, what we find is the stay and help, which is option A, tends to be pretty high. So when it's your family, the majority of the class says they're going to stay and help their family. When it's a bus full of criminals, there's a very big change where there are still people that will stay and help the criminals, but we see a whole bunch more people go with swim to shore. And then when we do the puppies, it's kind of back to where the family was again in terms of staying and helping. Again, you get individual answers, but it's something that I want you to kind of consider the results of as a class as a whole. We've done this for many semesters because it sort of gives us an idea going forward what might be happening, particularly with families versus criminals, and why people might do different things. Now, give you an example, there are lots of animals that live in groups, and there are a lot of animals that help other animals. And this was for a long time kind of a hard thing to understand in the context of Darwin's theory of evolution, where organisms or animals and plants and basically everything that's alive under Darwin's sort of theory of evolution, that animals do things to benefit themselves, essentially. So there are these squirrels, and we have squirrels like this around here. I think ours are a little bit different. But anyway, it's called Belding's ground squirrel. And again, our squirrels do a similar thing to this. But this particular study was done on Belding's ground squirrels. And what they do is they give off what are called alarm calls. So maybe you heard one before, but a squirrel will give out this loud sort of chirping sound, and it's a sign to warn other ground squirrels that there's a predator nearby, a person or a hawk or that kind of thing. And then all the ground squirrels take off running. And that is a form of what we call altruism. And altruism is something that one animal does at the risk of itself, or hurting itself or dying, to save others. And why would you do that? Why would you risk putting yourself in harm's way for another individual? So this person here, Vera Kopner Wynne Edwards, had what was called group selection, which is very much against Darwin's theory of evolution. And essentially what Wynne Edwards is saying is that animals do things to benefit the group. We help out our family because we're trying to help out our whole group. We live as a group and we're trying to help our family. Ground squirrels do these things because it's best for the group as a whole. And again, that's very much against sort of Darwin's theory, because in Darwin's theory of evolution, things do things to benefit themselves, and not the group. It's kind of, goes against the traditional features of that. So what they found out, though, by examining this closely, is that in these Belding ground squirrels, males tend to disperse and females remain in that spot. And what they also found is that the females call more. And if the females do happen to move away, they start calling less, meaning they give that alarm call less frequently. So what they did was they measured how many animals were giving the call versus how many were expected to. So if it was even across the board, meaning that if young males and if adult males and 1 year males and 1 year females and adult females gave the call at an equal frequency for their population size, then you would think that it's kind of across the board and it's equal. But what they found out was that adult females are far more likely to give the call. So there are more adult females anyway, but the number actually giving the call was much, much higher than that. There were many adult males also, but you see their frequency is very low relative to what you would expect. So what they discovered in this, and we'll see this in many cases, is this is not actually what it appears in the beginning, but instead this is what we call kinship behaviors. And kinship behaviors or kinship altruism is not just benefiting another animal at your expense, but you're actually benefiting yourself in a way, because you're doing behaviors that involve those you're related to. So this next person, W.D. Hamilton, a mathematician that came up with this kinship theory and the genetics of relatedness, came up with what's called Hamilton's rule, and it's mathematically symbolized as R multiplied by B, subtracting C, must be greater than 0, and that will explain the evolution or existence of behaviors that would tend to be harmful, you would think. So what W.D. Hamilton came up with is, instead of just looking at whether an animal survives or not under simple Darwinian rules, instead W.D. Hamilton said, this is more of an example of what we should call inclusive fitness, which is not just how many genes you pass on, but how many genes are passed on to your offspring, but other relatives as well. So R then becomes how related you are to the organisms that are involved in the situation. And so if you're related to, say, a brother or sister and you help them out, if the benefit of that genetically, if you save 7 brothers, for example, but you end up dying, there's a point in there where the rate that you're benefiting yourself is greater genetically because you're related to all these brothers or sisters or whatever have you. And if you subtract the cost, if that's greater than 0, then Hamilton's idea is that those traits will be passed on, and animals will do things at their own risk because it benefits the group of animals that you're related to. So not just benefiting the group, but instead you're related to them. Okay. Now, in order to be able to use Hamilton's rule, you have to be able to calculate a coefficient of relatedness. So what we do when we do that is we calculate how likely you are to be genetically related to the organism you're talking about. So let's say you have half siblings that share one parent. Okay. Not two parents, but one, half siblings. So if you want to calculate how genetically related B is to C, then what you do is you say, okay, if I take a gene out of this person here, so in this case, this is a male. Okay, if I take a gene from here, just pull one out randomly, what are the odds it's going to be found in parent A? And that would be 1/2, because this individual got half his genes from dad and half from mom. So it's 1/2. And then what are the odds of that same gene being found here? That's also 1/2. So what you have to do is you have to multiply the odds of both of those things happening. So it's 1/2 times 1/2, which gives you an R of 1/4, which means they're related to each other by 25%. What about full siblings? Well, here you have two different pathways, because you have pathway 1 through the female. So in this case, see here, circles are females and squares are males. So let's say I'm trying to figure this out here, and I say, well, what are the odds if I pull a gene out from C that it's going to be found in A? That's also going to be 1/2. Okay. And then what are the odds that that gene that I pulled from C that's found in A is also found in D? That's called a rule of multiplication, because you have two independent things and you're asking, what if both of those things happened? So in that case, it's 1/2 squared, just like before. But what we have to do is there's another pathway, because the question we're trying to ask is, how is C genetically related to D? So that's one pathway I could go, but I could also go this way. I could also go through the male in this case. So C, there's 1/2 of a chance that that gene could be found in B. And then there's also 1/2 of that chance that B could be found in D. So I'm going to multiply those together too. So that in that case, I have 1/4 plus 1/4. And this is called the rule of addition, because in this case, although I'm multiplying, I'm squaring the 1/2 to 1/2 there and the 1/2 to 1/2 there. The question is, how are they related? So they could be related from C to A to D, or C to B to D. So when you have that or part, where there are two different ways you could have that scenario, you add those two together. 1/4 plus 1/4, because the denominator is the same, I'm just going to add the numerator. That gives me 2/4, which is 1/2 that you see there. Okay. First cousins, same thing. I'm going to jump ahead and I'll show you here some of the examples of how all of them turn out. Let's do this one here. And I suggest what you do is you get out a piece of paper, draw this out, and see if first you can do it on your own. Maybe pause the video, see if you can do it on your own, and then check your math and see if you did it the way I'm going to do it here. Okay. So here in this case, we have an uncle and we have a niece, and we're trying to calculate how they're related. So what we could do is we're trying to calculate the relationship between these two here, D, and E. So first, if I take a gene from here, what are the odds it's found there, and then there, and then there? That's 1/2, and I got to go 1, 2, 3. So it's 1/2 cubed. Now, again, they aren't related just that way, because I could also go this way. I could go 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. So it's 1/2 cubed again. So if I do my math right here, that's 1/8 plus 1/8. Is that right? 4/8. Yep. Okay. So that gives me 2/8, which gives me 1/4. They should be. I like to draw triangles just so I know which one, what my answer is in the beginning or in the end. Okay, so that's what it should look like there. Now, lots of studies have been shown to change the way we think about things. In the 1970s, there was a kind of common theory in the 70s and early 80s that you were very likely to be killed or a crime against someone who was a relative. So they looked at these 512 homicide cases, and at the time, police were showing that most crime where, say, someone got killed or that kind of thing, homicides, most of the time it was by somebody in your own family, which, again, is not a thing you would expect in normal kin selection kinds of behavior, because you're hurting yourself genetically. So that was kind of an odd thing. But what they found was police in these studies were counting boyfriends and girlfriends and in-laws as relatives, and they are not obviously genetically relatives of one another. So what they did was, when they accounted for that, they found that only 6% of the time were they genetically related. Okay. There's an interesting thing that happens in honeybees, and in honeybees, you have this unusual thing where honeybee females will act in a way that's far more altruistic, if you will, than you would expect. And so what they found in honeybees and lots of ant societies and bees and wasps is that instead of being genetically related, how we're used to seeing, the females, which represent the bulk of the working group, are 75% related. And the reason for that is that males develop from an unfertilized egg. They only have one set of chromosomes, whereas females have two. So if you were to do the genetic relationship between two female honeybees, they are 75% related, because if I go from one female to the other female, it's 1/2. If I go from one female to the other, it's 1/2. So I have that same scenario. But the male is different in that if I pull a gene from here and it's found there, since the male only has one set, it also has to be found here. So half of their genome, 1/2 squared, is a quarter related between the females, but the other half is 100% related if I go through the male. Meaning if I pull a gene from this female and find it in the male, it always has to be found in this one because the male only has one. And so between 1/4 and 100, a quarter, if you find the in-between spot, that's 75%, or 3/4. Another way to look at it. Now, that ends up relating then to all kinds of interesting things that we call, as an example, the parent-offspring conflict, which I remind my kids about almost all the time. Parents are related to their offspring. Excuse me. Parents are related to their offspring by 50%, but the kid is related to the kid by 100%. So this kid and this kid and this kid here, I don't know what's happening. These are just things I find on the internet and go, that's an interesting story. So I don't know the story behind all of these. Most of them are a joke, I'm sure. But the kids are because they're related to themselves by 100%, their expectations of what they want are far greater and higher than genetically what the parents altruistically want to give. Parents do want to help their children, but roughly at about 50% of what the view from the child's point of view is. And this then goes into all kinds of interesting studies. For example, in primates, polyandrous parents. Polyandrous is where you're going to have a lot more competition because you're going to have a lot more mating conflict, more competition, less resources. If you had monogamous parents, if you live in a group that's monogamous, there's more resources, there's less competition. And what they found is in those polyandrous parents and those that are polyandrous, I lost my pen somehow. Whoops. Come on, pen. There we go. In the polyandrous parents, the primates have a faster fetal growth rate. They get larger quicker because when they come out, they have to be bigger so that their competition among the others can last. So they have manipulated in some way the female, they think, to get more resources to grow faster. That's also been shown in humans. There's a condition that you might know of called gestational diabetes, where babies get unusually large, and that can become a problem for mom. And this is generally thought of as something, as a medical condition of the mom. But perhaps what they're finding is that the baby, the cute little baby here, the fetal cells invade the maternal endometrium, and these cells manipulate the spiral arteries to make constriction more difficult. Constriction means it reduces the blood flow, which would lower the amount of sugar and nutrients the baby's getting. If the baby can manipulate those spiral arteries and keep them large, the baby gets more nutrients, more sugar, and it can get bigger. So babies might have, in some ways, the ability to take care of themselves even better by manipulating mom early on, even to get more nutrients. It also relates to what's called sibling rivalry, because once again, the baby's related to itself by 100%, but it's related to its brothers and sisters by 50%. So if there's not a lot of resources, many birds, such as egrets, when they hatch asynchronously, meaning one hatches and a little bit later the other hatches, the bigger one will bully the younger ones. It's bigger and it wants more food. And what you find is that in many cases, there isn't enough food to take care of all the babies. So, and like the little blue heron, they might have 4 or 5 chicks. The first 3 usually do pretty well, but the youngest ones, if they don't do well, then they end up very small. They don't have enough food. So the youngest siblings make a big difference. If they all live, the average of them is going to be small. If you lost a sibling, then the 4th one you see on the average, it's not bad, but that 5th one's almost too much. So often they'll push it out of the nest and things like that, which explains a lot of behavior you see among siblings, which I find interesting, having 2 kids that compete with each other. All right. So the next thing is, let's talk about the 4 different pathways why animals might help one another, and then we'll go into more of the actual idea of the evolution of social behavior, communication in social groups. So 4 pathways. The first is obviously kinselection. Animals that help those they're related to are in a way just helping themselves. So we call those behaviors kinselection. The next one, though, is called reciprocity. And this one gets a little more complex because in this idea, some animals will help other animals they're not related to with the expectation of them getting help back later on. So Reciprocity is where one animal helps another animal with a sort of calculated or understanding that it's going to get its help back at a later time. And one of the ways we often explain this is in what we call game theory. And one example of game theory where we can look at this is called the prisoner's dilemma. So the basic idea of the prisoner's dilemma, if you watch any kind of live crime shows, where, First 48 or one of those where a crime is committed and then they're trying to figure out who did it and they have multiple suspects, they bring the suspects into the police station and they question them. And they question them separately, and they try to get information out of them. So if you think about suspect 1 and suspect 2, as suspect 1 and suspect 2 cooperate with each other. Okay, so cooperate here does not mean they're cooperating with the police. Cooperate means they cooperate with each other. So let's say there's some kind of crime where things were stolen, but someone also got murdered. And the police have some evidence of you maybe stealing something, but not the murder part. They're trying to get after the murder, but they just have the stolen stuff. If you and the other suspect cooperate, then you get some small amount of jail time, maybe 1 year for each of you. Okay? But the problem is, if you cooperate, let's say this is you cooperate, and they defect or cheat, they rat you out and say, oh no, you did it. You stole the stuff and you also killed the person. Then you get hit really hard. You get the sucker's payoff. You get 5 years in jail, and they're under the temptation to cheat because they get out free. Okay? And that happens for both of you. That's why it's the prisoner's dilemma, because you have to decide if you're going to cooperate or you're going to defect or cheat, essentially. So same thing happens, but reverse. If they cooperate, if you're suspect 1 and they're suspect 2, and they cooperate, but then you defect or cheat, then you get out free and they get 5 years. So you're under the temptation to cheat, and they are under the sucker's payoff because they got ripped off. But what if you both defect? Like, what if you both give enough detail to rat both of you out? Well, that ends up also not being good. You get punishment for what's called mutual defection. You both defect, but that gives you 3 years and 3 years. And the number of years or the punishment itself directly doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a loss or gain of money or jail time. We use a prisoner's dilemma because it equates to jail time. But they use the same idea in business models and game theory to try to figure out how even companies might behave. So we use it in this case to understand how animals that aren't related to each other might behave under certain scenarios. But in fact, this idea of game theory and the prisoner's dilemma is played out in all kinds of different scenarios over and over again, and they have competitions on this, and it serves in all kinds of modeling for business models and that sort of thing to try to figure out how one company might behave relative to another company. And again, these are the things I just told you about: the temptation to cheat, where you defect and your partner cooperates, the mutual cooperation, you both cooperate, punishment for mutual defection, you both defect, and then the sucker's payoff, you cooperate but your partner defects. And so again, the amount of jail time or money you gain or lose doesn't matter, but the relative amounts do, meaning under those 4 scenarios they have to have the relative levels of gain or loss for the model to work. Now, they've tried out this reciprocity model under different scenarios to find out what the best strategy is, or which one is most stable. And a stable strategy where animals tend to fall in and very little change happens. We call this in evolution an evolutionary stable strategy. When you see certain behavioral patterns that are kind of consistent and don't change all that much, we call that an evolutionary stable strategy. And they've examined many different ones, like maybe you should always defect or you should alternate. And what they found that works very commonly in all kinds of social and evolutionary and business models is this one called tit for tat, TFT, tit for tat. And in tit for tat, what you do is you cooperate, but then you replicate what was done to you. So if the other partner, whether it's a criminal or whether it is a business partner, if they defect on you, you do the same thing back. Okay? If they cooperate, you cooperate. If they defect, you defect. So the idea is that you give them a chance first by cooperating, because that gives you the best overall scenario. But if they defect and you keep cooperating, you keep losing. So to cut your losses short, you replicate the move that the other one did in the last one. Okay, lots of examples also in nature of this. One of them are these reciprocity found in vampire bats. And so in vampire bats, the females mostly have low R's, which means they're not related to each other. And vampire bats eat and drink blood. And in the roost, when they go back, they often will regurgitate blood meals and give it to others, which sounds disgusting, but you're eating blood anyway. You know, it's just they're vampire bats. What do you want? And so what they found is they will regurgitate blood and give it back to and share it with those. But if a bat that they're roosting next to doesn't give them blood, they can remember which bats weren't cooperating. And the next time that they're sort of being asked to share food, they have a pretty good memory about that, and then they don't share it the next time, which is interesting. And this study here, I'll talk more about this later on, but this is also related to prisoner's dilemma. And what they did is, in this case, they had, this particular study was done on women, and it's a newer field, which kind of scares me, called neuroeconomics, where they're trying to discover what's happening in your brain under certain economic decisions to try to maximize how they can market things and that sort. So what they did was this study, again, it's done just on women. They take women and they put them in a fMRI machine, a functional magnetic resolution imaging machine, and they have subject 1 and subject 2 play a version of the prisoner's dilemma. And what they found is that when, again, in women, when there's mutual cooperation, when the females cooperated, the woman getting the fMRI, certain regions of her brain would light up that indicated the reward system portions of her brain, suggesting that, at least in women, again, this is just done on women, that women tend to like scenarios where cooperation occurs. Now, don't know about if this was done on men or not as well, or what the outcome was, but we'll talk more about this when we do human behavior coming up soon. Okay, the third pathway is what's called byproduct mutualism, and this is where two organisms help each other because there's really no other way out. There's no temptation to cheat because your survival or your ability to get the behavior done is dependent totally on the other person. Okay, so what happens, let's say the classic example, you're spelunking. Spelunking is where you're cave exploring and a big giant rock rolls in your way and it blocks your entrance and you can't get out of the cave, and you and your friend are trying to get out. Well, if your friend or you go, well, I'm not helping, we've been arguing together, so I'm not going to help you. Well, then you're not getting out either, because it takes the two of you maybe to move the rock. So there's no temptation to cheat. If you're related, then you get into kinselection again, because you're related. But if you're not related and it takes both of you to do it, we call that byproduct mutualism. The fourth pathway that's been around for a long time, is group selection. As I've already said, that group selection really didn't fit in with Darwin's theory of evolution because it seemed like organisms should do things that benefit themselves. And as I said, what we find is most of the time, animals that do things that help others, it turns out they're related to them, or it turns out they expect something in return, or they can't do it on their own. So group selection is sort of the fourth one, where it turns out to be pretty rare. But it does happen, we think, in cases. And what we call this is trait group selection, because there are some cases primarily done with ants. So ants live in these big groups where often they're related to each other, but not entirely 100% related to each other, 75% maybe. But ants will do things that seem to go beyond even the 75%. And they think what's happening here is it's selecting for the whole group, because there are cases where the ant colony as a whole, if it doesn't act as a group, the whole colony could suffer and go down. So there's more of a tendency to see group selection in scenarios like that. But again, other than ants and a couple of other rare scenarios, group selection doesn't seem to be nearly as common as what we thought. Okay, now we're getting ready to go into our sociobiology and human behavior part. We'll do human behavior next lecture. But first, we want to talk about why things live in a group and consider some of the costs. So if you live in a group, there's competition for food. There tends to be more parasites. It's easier for predators to notice you. So if you're a big group of things and a hawk's flying over, the hawk can see you better as a group when you take off running. These two birds are the same age, but this one lives in a dense colony where they have more of these parasitic bugs that suck their blood, and so you have more parasites. However, there are benefits to living in a group. You can divide up labor. You can hunt as a group if you're a group of lions. It's harder for predators to catch you as an individual, which we call the dilution effect. So as I said, a hawk flies over and it can see these squirrels all taking off running, but because the hawk has to go after one, usually, of you, and you all take off running, there's this pause where the hawk has to hone in on trying to get one of you. And that brief moment where it's distracted by all the movement makes your individual odds better at escaping. So a lot of animals live in groups, and although it's easier to see the group, it's harder for if you're a zebra and you're out by yourself and a bunch of lions see you, they're going to go after just you. You're the only one. But if there's 20 of you, your individual odds are better at escaping. Okay, so how are we going to figure out how things cooperate, why they do that, why would they live in a group? And once again, kin selection is going to be our big thing. If you're related to animals in the group, you're probably going to behave in a certain way to make that happen. If you're related to the individuals in the group, the relatedness times the benefit, if it's greater than the cost, then that's going to work the best. Kinship is kind of like you saving yourself because you're saving your own genes. Okay. Next then is reciprocity, meaning that you're going to help out, but you're only going to help out because you kind of expect something in return. And byproduct mutualism, as we said, once again, you can't really do the job yourself. You need the other individuals, and so without the other individuals, nothing's going to get done. And then the last one, again, is group selection, where you function as an entire group. Okay, now that gets us this into then the sociobiology portion. And in sociobiology, what we find, this was sort of new in the 1970s, and the sort of ultimate sociobiologist of all time, the one that sort of was the grandfather, if you will, of the field of sociobiology, is this brilliant ant biologist named E.O. Wilson. That you see there. And he wrote this very big book in the 1970s called Sociobiology, the New Synthesis. And it generated a great deal of interest and debate and some friction. A lot of people didn't like it. And mainly it's for that last chapter. And the last chapter talks about humans. So what sociobiology is, it's the evolution and the scientific study of social behavior, how animals work as a group and socially interact with one another as a functional group. How does that come about? And then he gives lots of examples in his book, and then he goes on into the book to explain the behavior of things like humans and how we might operate under these same rules. And that's what we're going to talk about in our last chapter. Okay. Now I'll give you some examples. E.O. Wilson was primarily an ant biologist. So a lot of work was done on ants early on. And we'll start talking about these leafcutter ants that work in these particular groups. And the leafcutter ants, as you may have seen on shows, they cut up these pieces of leaves and they take them back underground where they have this fungus and they feed the plants to the fungus. So they're not actually eating the plants directly. They're eating secretions made by the fungus that digest the plants. And they live in these big, large colonies, up to 8 million individuals, and they come in different sizes. So you have a queen that lays the eggs, and then you have a subcaste system of workers that are all female, related to each other like sisters. And the smallest ones take care of the brood and the fungus gardens. The broods are the baby ants. The next largest ones will defend foraging columns. So you'll see a column like here. This might be one here, for example. They're moving along like this and they're bringing the food. You'll have some that just sort of defend the edge of that. The ones with head widths between 1.8 and 2.2 millimeters are used primarily for cutting down leaves, and they found that that's the optimal head size for chomping the bits of leaves off and carrying them like that. And then you have these really big ones like this one here, and those are the workers or the soldiers, and those will be used to fight off big predators or carry larger pieces of leaves or fruit that the other ones can't carry. And then you have what are called the wing reproductives. These are young females that fly off and will mate and do this nuptial flight. And when they go, they take a little bit of the fungus culture with them, with her, so she can start her own new colony. So they work in this very coordinated method. You also have slave-making ants, where one group of ants go out and raid a colony and they bring back another kind of ant and force that ant to take care of the babies of theirs. So another coordinated event. And there's actually several species of slave-making ants. You also have termites that live in groups, and they also have a caste system that includes larvae, workers, soldiers, and reproductives. And once again, they live in a organized sort of colony. For mammals, most of the social behavior and social things that we see are primarily in insects. But there are some, and this is probably the closest one, the naked mole rat, that live in these arid regions of Africa, where they live in groups of 200 to 300 individuals, and you'll have one reproductive female 1 to 3 breeding males, and then a bunch of soldiers that carry for the young and protect the colony. And the rest are workers. And they dig these burrows underground that connect to each other, and they live once again as this coordinated group. Okay, Hamadryas baboons that you see here. Baboons are an aggressive primate. They live on the plains of Northeast Africa and Southeast Arabia, and they also have several levels of organization. One male with 1 to 10 females. Male tends to be larger, and if the females wander off, the male will result to violence and beat up the female. And they have several breeding units that will get together for feeding, and then at night, when aggression is lower, the several bands of those feeding groups will form sleeping groups. So once again, you have these group behavior where you have a group of individuals, and in this case the group size changes based on whether they're in their reproductive family mode, their feeding mode, or their sleeping mode. The next are howler monkeys, and howler monkeys are found in South America, and they tend to have less aggression. Males are about 30% larger than females, so not twice the size. That's one of the things we'll see when we talk about reproductive behavior, is that the larger the differences in the sex sizes, the more aggression there tends to be. If the male's 2 or 3 times the size of the female, or vice versa, you tend to get much more aggression in those groups. So group size varies, but it's often about 3 males, 8 females, and there's 7 young, so somewhere around 15 to 20-ish. And what howler monkeys do is they howl to maintain group spacing, and they eat leaves from trees and live in this group, and they maintain their group distance by howling so that they don't have to have direct conflicts. And then the last of these groups that we'll talk about are gorillas. And gorillas, again, you tend to have a very, very large male relative to females. So you have one male and several adult females with their offspring. The offspring can be, of course, male or female, but as those males get bigger, they tend to leave. As they get older, they roam and pick up immigrating females from other groups. Because again, you have this large male silverback that sort of runs the group. So once the females have male offspring that get old enough, they're kind of pushed out of the group, and they go on and form their own group elsewhere if they can. They use lots of vocalizations and lots of facial expressions to communicate, and this then, as we go into talking about humans, is a good sort of example of the kind of things we're going to see in our human groups and things that we're going to witness. That, according to E.O. Wilson, as he said in the last chapter, the question is, can any of these things be found in humans? And he points out some of them. And people don't like that idea. People like the idea that humans can think for themselves and are not animals per se. But I'll show you some characteristics where some of the things we've talked about throughout the semester you can kind of see play out in large groups of humans as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Hope everyone's having a good day, and I will talk with you soon.